Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see you. My name is Morty Labaton. I'm Hadar's Director of Programs. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. If you've been here for the last couple of weeks, thank you for joining for those as well. I hope you found these lectures to be illuminating, meaningful, challenging perhaps, and overall just a source of meaning right now in this time. A few quick notes before we get started. We are going to, the format of this program will be lecture style, which is to say that Rav Yftsan will give his talk, and we are going to keep the chat function off actually to allow you to focus on the substance of the lecture. However, please keep track of your notes and questions, as there will be time at the end for a few people to raise their hand and ask their question, hopefully out loud. Second, we are enabling the auto transcription for this program, which means that there will be subtitles that are automatically generated. If those are bothersome or distracting, you can always turn them off by going to the bottom of your screen. You should see a button that says more, and you'll see hide or show subtitles. Two more quick items. This is the third and final of our lecture series, but there's plenty more happening at Hadar. Most relevant is our Hanukkah Companion. We have an amazing resource of Torah learning and text study for you to take along with you throughout your Hanukkah experience. I just put the link in the chat. Check it out. Download it today. We also have our Joey Weisenberg and the Hadar Ensemble concert coming up later December. It's an amazing experience. We're live streaming it and having people in person and a live audience. If you're in the New York area or want to travel to the New York area, get your tickets today. Finally, because this is the third and final of the lecture series, I want to thank all the staff and moderators who put in the time and effort to make this happen. I want to thank Rav Yftsan, for presenting this material, and I want to thank all of you for coming and taking the time out of your just busy schedules and lives right now for a bit of Torah. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rav Yftsan to conclude this lecture series.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back with you for a third week. Thank you to Morty Labaton, and Mazel Tov to him on his recent nuptials and getting married. So Mazel Tov to Morty. Welcome to part 3 of this series on Midrash and the Rabbinic imagination, where we've been exploring really the craft of Midrash and the ways in which we have in this body of literature not only interesting stories, interesting supplemental material, but really an incredible window into an amazing group of people who have been going through a process I have repeatedly emphasized has 3 parts to it that we've kind of laid out at the beginning of each of the source sheets as we've gone through them. It's a group of people who are really in love with the text of the Torah, the text of the Bible. They read it like a love letter, very carefully, looking at all the parsings, all the differences, all the variants, and allowed things in the text that were unusual or noteworthy to stand out for them. And they were also people who carried a tremendous number of religious ideas around with them, ideas that felt compelling for the human and Jewish condition. And Midrash is the genre, is the literary space where the text and the idea meet in the middle, and where those compelling texts in search of a place in the canon find a place to rest. So we've been doing any number of kind of sub-themes on that genre. Our first week was devoted to characters that seem to have left the literary stage only to be discovered as actually alive and well, and perhaps operating in the background of other narratives. We last week looked at kind of more minor characters that leave us wanting more, and the ways in which the Midrashic enterprise plays them out into being larger than their literary footprint in terms of the messages that they can convey. And tonight I want to turn to what I'm referring to as crossover characters. And for those of you who like cinematic universes or various other kinds of fantasy and fiction, you know there are no moments quite in those universes, literary worlds, where a character from one place suddenly shows up in another. A crossover from one sitcom to another. A superhero that suddenly appears in the context of other superheroes. And that crossover character phenomenon is another aspect of how the world of Midrash gets built. And we're going to focus in a very targeted way tonight on two examples of this, where we have a character known, perhaps even to some good degree, from another part of the Tanakh, who is then parachuted in to another context, and the ways in which that crossover enables a certain kind of storytelling and a certain kind of conveyance of values that otherwise is unimaginable. So let's jump right in. We're going to share the source sheet with you, and you've also got it in the chat if you want to go to it directly. So starting here in Roman numeral 2, where we're thinking and talking about crossover characters, we're going to start with Yves Yftsan and Boaz. Yves Yftsan, if I were to do a poll of most well-known biblical characters, would probably rank near bottom. And he, in fact, only has 3 lines devoted to him in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges. You have in the book of Judges any number of narratives that are quite expansive. Ehud ben Gera, Dvorah and Barak, Shimshon. Right before the narratives of Shimshon, the many, many chapters devoted to Samson and his battles with the Philistines, we have very short vignettes of a number of other judges who were leaders, significant enough to be named in Israel, but about whom we know very little and about whom there is simply sparse detail. One of them is Yftsan. Here are the verses. We can read them all. It won't take that much time. Vayishpot acharav et Yisrael Yftsan mi Beit Lachem. Yftsan from Bethlehem judged Israel next in line after Yiftach, another judge about whom we know quite a bit. ויהי לו 30 בנים ו30 בנות שילח החוצה ו30 בנות הביא לבניו מן החוץ וישפוט את ישראל 7 שנים. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters who he sent out, which seems to mean married off to men outside of his family, and 30 daughters or young women who he took in from outside, Livanav, to marry his sons. He ruled Israel for 7 years. Vayamot Yftsan vayikaver bebeit Lachem. Yftsan died and was buried in Beit Lechem. That's it. That's the beginning and the end of Yftsan. We don't know much about him other than his location, which I've bolded here in the original, Mi Beit Lachem, and we know something about him having lots of kids. The crossover begins with a very simple statement by Rav in the Babylonian Talmud. Amar Rav Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Yftsan ze Boaz. This character Yftsan, this hidden judge, is actually the quite famous Boaz from Megillat Ruth, from the book of Ruth. Yftsan is none other than Boaz. I'll say just as a historic note, part of what's interesting about this Midrash, this is an innovation of Rav, the great early sage of Babylonian Jewry. It has no record of existing as a tradition in Eretz Yisrael. That is to say, there are sources in Eretz Yisrael that quite plainly take for granted that Yftsan and Boaz are two different people. So Rav, we really actually have a glimpse of him innovating this equation between the two, and it makes it all the more striking. What was he trying to say? But first, let's just get what's the thing in the text. We're always looking for what's in the text that gives him the ability to say this quite shocking thing, Yftsan ze Boaz. Well, if you look at the opening chapters of Ruth, of the book of Ruth, you find that the entire story is cast as Bimei Shvot HaShoftim, during the period of the judges, So it makes sense that we would look to the book of Judges for some kind of anchor, biographical or otherwise, of where the story of Boaz is taking place. And Boaz, lo and behold, is from Beit Lechem, as is the family of Naomi, married to a man, Elimelech, from Beit Lechem, Yehudah. They go off to Moab. All the men die. Naomi returns back with Ruth, and Ruth eventually is joined to Boaz. But we have a scene in Beit Lechem playing out in the period of the Judges. Aside from the fact, put aside that this is Beit Lechem Yehudah, and it could be that Yves Yftsan is Beit Lechem HaGalilit. There was another town of Beit Lechem. There's a modern Israeli yeshuv called Beit Lechem HaGalilit. That's up in the north, in the Galil. But not unreasonable to assume it's the same Beit Lechem. And indeed, actually, if you go through the book of Shoftim, the first time you encounter the location Beit Lechem is with Yves Yftsan. And so Rav makes a reasonable kind of joining together of these narratives if you're looking for a home. Well, significant man, Boaz, in Beit Lechem in the time of the period of the Judges. And we've got a judge from Beit Lechem, not too far-fetched to suggest they are one and the same. So that's part of where we get the linkage between them. But let's get a sense of what is not such a good match. In the 4th chapter of the book of Ruth, we find that when Boaz and Ruth are finally going to be joined, all the people at the gate and the elders present for the kind of marriage and redemption ceremony that's going on there say, Eidim, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. Prosper in Ephrata and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Yehudah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now, we'll finish the passage in a moment, but pay attention there. All the signs in this passage suggest that Boaz is childless up to this point. There's a blessing here that Rachel and Leah, just as they come to a childless Yaakov and build him up with children, oh, may you be built up through this woman Ruth in the same way. And min hazera asher yitain Hashem lecha, min hana'ara azot, suggests you don't yet have seed. God will give you the possibility of having offspring through this young woman. And indeed, there's a hint in the verse of there being something about Boaz being so old that he sort of is no longer really able to even do this on his own. Vayikach Boaz et Ruth vatihilo leisha, he marries her, vayavo eleha, and they consummate the relationship. Vayitein Hashem lah hirayon vateled ben. Very unusual formulation. If you blinked, you might think there was almost an immaculate conception there. God gave her pregnancy, and she had a son. Okay? But the notion here of God is getting involved in this couple who otherwise would not necessarily have a child. And Boaz seems to be given offspring for the first time. It seemed to be a problem with the theory that Yves Yftsan ze Boaz, because we don't know anything about Yves Yftsan. But one thing we know, he had 30 sons. And he had 30 daughters that he married out. He's a man virile and potent enough and living a long enough life to have 60 children. That does not seem to match the narrative, at least on a surface level and by deeper implication as well, that we get in Megillat Ruth about Boaz. So with that, we can appreciate how there's something actually a little odd about the mapping. But then the Gemara is going to marvelously fill in this tradition of Rav, and we can see this on the following page, on page 3. So here we are in the continuation of that passage in the Talmud Bavli after this statement that Rav made, Yves Yftsan ze Boaz. I'm going to linger on the first line here for a moment, because the question that the Gemara begins with is, Mai kamash malan? What does this teach us? I want to just linger there for a minute, because I could actually have named the whole series Mai kamash malan, because this is sort of a proof of one of the main claims I've been making to you throughout, which is what we are involved in here is always an exercise in reading and always an exercise in fingering an idea, a principle, a value that's important to us. And the Gemara reveals that here. Why bother telling me Yves Yftsan is Boaz? You could say, because he is. I'm just telling you. Or I'm tying up loose ends. Or I find it a curiosity that I'd like you to know about. No, my kamash malan. There's got to be a reason. The Midrash is always motivated and animated by an idea. So what did Rav want to hammer home by telling us Yves Yftsan is Boaz? He says the following. It accords with another statement of Rabbi bar Rav Huna, because Rabbi bar Rav Huna said, in the name of Rav, so continuing in Rav's name this tradition, Me'ah ve'esrim mishtaot asa Boaz levanav. שנאמר, ויהי לו 30 בנים ו30 בנות שילח החוצה, ו30 בנות הביא לבניו מן החוץ, וישפוט את ישראל 7 שנים, ובכל אחת ואחת עשה 2 משתאות, אחד בבית אביו, ואחד בבית חמיו. So what do we have, says Rav? A man who made 120 wedding feasts. How did he get to 120 wedding feasts? Well, he had 60 kids, and all of them got married off. And for each one, he had 2 parties. One in the father's house for the sons, that was him, right? And vice versa, the in-laws, and one in the in-laws' house. So 120 parties, someone with success in life, a lot of children celebrating it. Uvechulan lo zimein et manoach. But he did not invite to a single one of the 120 parties Manoach. Who is Manoach? Manoach is the father of Shimshon. Manoach is the childless man who in the next chapter in Shoftim is going to have his own miraculous encounter along with his wife with an angel of God, and they are going to give birth to a savior. But before Manoach was Shimshon's father, Manoach was just a hapless, barren man. And Boaz, meaning Yftsan, one and the same, said about him, it's not worth inviting him. He is a sterile mule. How will he pay me back? Meaning, he's never going to have a wedding party for his kids because he's not going to have kids. So I'm going to send him a wedding invitation, pay for his spot at the shmorg, and I'm never going to get him back? Not doing it. The guy's a loser. I'm not getting involved with him. I'm not inviting him. And then the devastating coda to the story, Tana, in here cast as in Tanaitic voice, so some of the commentators on the Gemara think it should just be a continuation of Rav's statement, V'chulan metu bechayav. All those 60 kids that he married off, they all died while he was still alive. V'hainu da'amrei enashe, v'chayecha deyaldat shitin, shitin lamalich, hichapal ve'olidcha demishitin zariz. Why do you need the 60 children that you beget during your lifetime? Go to the trouble and beget one who will be more diligent than 60. A kind of common saying that seems to have cropped up around whether it's this tradition or a sentiment like the one driving this tradition, which is people can get really wrapped up in numbers, in quantity, in this case, in children, in ways that they think they've secured their legacy by sheer brute force. And at the end of the day, it's worthless if they don't make it and they don't continue your line. Invest in one child who will be more diligent than the 60. Almost maybe a hint here that the metu bechayav here might not just be a literal death, but perhaps a spiritual one. The idea that Yftsan / Boaz had all these children, but by the time he was in his old age, they were no longer on the scene. Were no longer relevant for what he stood for and what he was trying to accomplish. Now, in a way, flight of fancy, making things up. Where did we get to this? But again, take seriously the fact that in the time of the judges in Beit Lechem, both Boaz and Yftsan operate. The idea that it's reasonable to say that a man of Boaz's prominence, as he clearly is in the Megillah, would have had a significant leadership role. And build on top of that the next story of noticing Yftsan has tons of children, Boaz has none. And you then get actually this incredibly complex, poignant, and painful story that emerges from the equation Yftsan ze Boaz. And according to the Gemara, Mai Kamash Malan, what was the point of telling us Yftsan ze Boaz? So that you understand something deeper about Boaz's life experience and his character. Lest you think Boaz is just a nice old man with money who helps out Ruth, and at the end of the day they live happily ever after, and the Davidic line and the Messiah come out of them. You actually have to understand that Yftsan, when he was younger, didn't understand about that at all. Didn't understand about generosity. He was actually a miserly, inwardly focused person. A person who earlier in life would not invite people where he didn't think there was some kind of quid pro quo. The man Boaz rises out of the ashes of Yftsan, who is defeated on some level in Act 1 of his life, but comes back a childless, old, wiser, kinder man who is then able to unite with Ruth, to show her generosity without any hope of getting anything in return. It's from there that the Davidic line and the Messiah is born, not from people who just figure out a way how to accrue wealth and might for themselves. It's a kind of amazing, unnecessary backstory for Boaz that you wouldn't think had to be surfaced, but a combination of the text beckoning you to Beit Lechem in the days of the Shoftim, and this driving idea of the notion that maybe people like Boaz are not born. Maybe they're actually made. Maybe the Torah, the Tanakh here, is trying to give you a very powerful lesson in what it is to focus on the quality of the things that are important to us in life and not the quantity. And in fact, the crossover character of Boaz in Sefer Shoftim, and on some level the mutual crossing over of Yftsan with all his children showing up childless in the book of Ruth, is then able to tell a completely different story with all sorts of other dimensions. And again, Rav here, Mai Kamash Malan, I think wants to tell us something about how that kind of character is built and how it will often actually emerge from pain, failure, lack of perspective, and only then understanding how to redirect and reorient your life. That's our character number one. We're going to move on now to Sefer Iyov. And Sefer Iyov is a book that reads pretty well on its own. That is to say, it's a story about a man who is suffering, who's given a full narrative of the ways in which he is wealthy and eventually falls from that place of power and grace. And then many, many chapters of rumination, philosophical and otherwise. How does God run the world this way? What is the place of the righteous who suffer? And then a coda where he's brought back and restored, at least in wealth, to where he was before, and in terms of the children that he loses, to have a new family, new children that he begins again with. That kind of works on its own. But when you start probing and try to make Sefer Iyov, the book of Job, about an actual man in an actual time and place, it becomes very hard to do so. So here you've got selection from the first chapters here. It begins, we've got the Hebrew here on the bottom of 3 and going into 4, and then the English picks up in the translation. We'll have the English on the screen, and I'll refer to the original here. Ish haya be'eretz Utz, Iyov shemo. A man from the land of Utz. We'll come back to that, what that means. It's not an obvious place that we necessarily have some particular location for. We've got monikers of him as Tam, Yashar, Yerei Elohim, Sar Meira. He's got lots of cattle. He is greater than all the others in the east. And then the story, in a horrible way, starts to play out. Messenger comes and tells him, all of your oxen were plowing, the donkeys were there, and then there were Sabaeans, raiding bands that came, carried them off. They killed the people caring for the animals. I'm the only one who was left. Another one shows up and said, Eish Elohim nafla min hashamayim. God's fire fell from heaven, and I'm the only one who survived. And then another one later in coming and says, your children, all your sons and daughters, were eating and drinking beveit achehem abechor. They were beveit achehem abechor in their oldest, your oldest child's house. Their eldest brother. And a wind came, struck the house, it collapsed upon them, and they all died. Job, Iyov, nonetheless, despite all of this, declares, Arom yatzati mibet animi ve'arom ashuv shama, Hashem natan v'Hashem lakach v'yishem Hashem mevorach, will not give any reproach to God. At the end of the narrative, we hear about the Satan, who's been active throughout, some kind of heavenly adversary, obviously translated later in English as the Satan, but the kind of accusing angel up above. And after given license by God, not only to destroy Iyov's property, he's given the license to go after Iyov's body, as long as he doesn't kill him. And it says, Vayachat Iyov b'shchin ra. He smote him with horrible boils and inflammation from the tip of his foot up to his head. And Iyov ends up sitting in the dust, bemoaning his fate, but refusing to directly blame God. Okay, so that's the narrative, as you can see, with very few clues as to what's actually happening here and where it's playing out. And I want to give you just a flavor of this. We won't go through all the proof texts, but in Bereshit Rabbah, the next text further on, where they try to get a sense, an answer to the question of, Iyov matai haya. When did Iyov live? Can we put him anywhere? And I'll just sprinkle it with a few of the proofs that back up these formulations. But look at it, right? In the time of Avram, in the time of Yaakov, in the time of the tribes, he was born when they went down to Egypt, died when they came out. In the days of the judges, in the days of the Kasdim, in the days of the kingdom of Shiva, in the days of Achashverosh. All of these have some angle on them. In the time of Avraham, Yishaya be'eretz Utz, the land of Utz, et Utz bechoro, et buzachiv. We know at the end of the Akedah, Avraham finds out about a nephew that he's had, whose name is Utz. So maybe it's in the time of Avraham. We have things about the Chaldeans, the Kasdim, because the word Kasdim appears in those early chapters. Shiva, another nation that appears in those early chapters. There are any number of hints that people try to get at here. You have a kind of culmination of frustration when Reish Lakish says, Iyov lo haya velo nihya. Job never existed at all. Come on. This is just one big parable. This is not meant to be located in history at all. So a huge debate here. Rabbi Yochanan, he's coming back from the exile. Rabbi Hanina says he was an Oved Kochavim. He was a Gentile, laying bare the question of, is he even Jewish at all? Or is this just a story of any man, independent of the covenant between God and Israel, struggling with the question of why the righteous suffer? But I want to dig down on one of these positions, which is that of Rabbi Leib, in the name of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chalach, who says, Iyov was born when they went down to Egypt, and died when they came out. Biridatan lemitzrayim nolad, uva'aliyatan met. And I want to first understand the reading, the text that drives this. If we go back up for a moment to the passage, and here in the Hebrew, in the early chapters of Iyov, well, actually, Eretz Utz, though in a way it means a no man's land, right? Reish Lakish would have approved of the modern Hebrew rendering of the Wizard of Oz, which is rendered as Hakosem me Eretz Utz, where Oz and Utz are kind of some magical no man's land. But there is actually a passage in Yirmiyahu that suggests that Utz is somehow synonymous with Mitzrayim. And if you start to pay attention to some of the other markers in the text, you see something amazing. What does he have? He has mikneh. He has cattle. And what happens? They all get destroyed. That sounds kind of like Makat Dever, the plague that wipes out Vayamot Kol Miknei Mitzrayim. Then you've got Eish Elohim Nafla Min Hashamayim. That sounds kind of like Makat Barad, the plague of hail. Vayhi Varad ve'esh mitlakachat betoch habarad. You have, if we jump further down, Iyov being smitten with shchin. Obviously, one of the plagues of boils. And then what do we have? A family wiped out when the house collapses on a bechor, on a firstborn. So you have actually, to the close reader of Iyov, hints that maybe the story of Iyov is actually playing out in the background of the Eser Makot. His trials and travails are a side scene of one minor character in Mitzrayim, which in the context of Shemot, in the telling of the book of Exodus, is all about a national conflict. But did you ever think about all the individual people who potentially suffered, who potentially had their own stories? If you've never read Etgar Keret's short story, Makat Bechorot, I highly recommend it. It's of that genre as well. But here, a couple thousand years before Etgar Keret, the modern Israeli fiction writer, you've got a potential reading of Iyov, which says, yeah, he's miordei Mitzrayim, and he went up with them, out. Why? Because look at the story, it screams the Eser Makot. Now, with that possibility in mind, with that notion of the textual prod that is locating Iyov as a crossover character in the Exodus movie, as it were, we now have to ask ourselves, what would that gain us? What would we learn from that? Mai kamash malan. And here I want to pick out three angles in other midrashim that are built off of this basic insight that perhaps Iyov is located best in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, for three, I think, for my money, extremely powerful messages that only the placement of Iyov as a crossover character in Yetziat Mitzrayim truly allows you to see. So let's take them one at a time. We'll move forward to page 5. And the first is what I'm going to call the lesson about what it means to be meek to a fault. In Sota Yud Aleph, in the Talmud Bavli, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Simai, Shlosha hayu be'ota etza. Rabbi Simai sets the scene for the moment where in the first chapter of the book of Shmot, Paro says, Hava nitzchakmalo pen yirbeh. We better outwit, deal cunningly with this people, otherwise they're going to get too big. V'nilcham banu ve'ala min haaretz. And eventually they'll become a military threat and either leave or drive us out. But nitzchakma is a plural verb. Let us deal cunningly with them. Who's Paro talking to? Says Rabbi Simai, midrashically thinking, I'll tell you who the three people who were there. Bilaam, the Iyov, the Yitro. Kind of greatest hits of Gentiles in the Tanakh. You got Bilaam, later meets up again with the people at the end of the desert time, teaming up with Balak to curse them, bless them, comes back, seems to team up with Midian in order to attack the people further, but Bilaam is there. Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, future father-in-law is there, and Iyov, Job is there. Each of them plays a different role. Bilaam sheya'atz neherag, Iyov sheshatak nidon b'yisurim, Yitro shebarach zachu mibnei banav sheyeshvu b'lishkat hagazit. Let's start on the outside and work our way in. Bilaam was actively a part of the plot. When Paro said, hey, what should we do here? Bilaam gave his assent, or even, as I translated it here, potentially hatched the plan. He was the one who said, yeah, why don't you do hard labor? And maybe then later suggested, kill them, kill the boys, throw the boys into the Nile. He was punished by being killed later on. Probably also a way of closing the loop of what was so terrible about Bilaam, given that he blessed Israel at the end of the day. This is the backstory to that suffering. Yitro heard this. He said, I'm out of here. This is a corrupt regime. I cannot be a part of it. I'm leaving. I'm going to Midian. And because he completely extricates himself from the corrupt rule of Paro, he ends up having the merit that some of his descendants sit on the Sanhedrin. The notion that some of Moshe's descendants eventually find their way into those halls of power. But we're interested in Iyov. What does Iyov do? Iyov is not a bad guy. Iyov does not plot against the people. He does not take the road of Bilaam. But he is also somewhat passive. He is somewhat afraid. He is not courageous. Maybe he's somewhat complacent. Maybe he says, it doesn't seem like it'll get that bad. But he is shatak. He is meek. Going back to the description of him, what happens? How is Iyov described in the opening chapters of that book? Yirei Elohim v'sar meira. He fears God and he avoids evil. But sar meira, right? Sur meira va'asei tov. It's not enough to avoid the evil. You have to do good. He doesn't necessarily do good. This too, undoubtedly, is partially a search for why does Iyov suffer? There's a kind of rebellion in any midrash like this against the notion that someone totally righteous would ever suffer. A desire to say, no, I'm committed to the notion that life is fair and looking for that kind of backstory. But there's something else here, which is only by taking Iyov and placing him in this story can we actually see the ways in which someone can be a good person and can feel like they're going to be quiet, they're not going to speak up, they're going to just avoid having their hands get dirty, and nonetheless end up really being on the wrong side of history. And as a result, nidon b'yisurim. For that he suffers. And there we are also able to learn the Yirei Elokim actually have a role to play beyond just being God-fearing on their own turf. The Iyovs of the world have to figure out minimally how to be more like Yitro, even if they don't have the power to actually overthrow the king. That's lesson number one. Let's look at a second piece here, which is a different kind of angle. A really amazing set of midrashim here, again, built on putting Iyov as a crossover character in the Exodus story. Rabbi Ishmael taught, Iyov was one of Pharaoh's servants, Me'avdei Paro haya, and was one of the most prominent people in his entourage. Because when it talks about the God-fearing Egyptians who, because they heard about the plague of hail that was coming, they decided to heed the warnings of the God of Israel delivered through Moshe and to bring their animals inside. How does it describe them? Hayarei et devar Hashem me'avdei Faro heinis et avadav et mikneu min hasadeh. The one who feared the word of God from the servants of Paro. There were servants of Paro who feared the word of God, brought their mikneh, their cattle, in. And what does it say about Iyov? Ishtam v'yashar v'yirei Elohim v'sar meira. Yirei Elohim, he fears God. The Yarei et Dvar Hashem must have been Iyov. So Iyov, we have a further literary hook to place him in the story of the Makot of the plagues. But now the kind of devastating coda to that story as it's laid out in the Mechilta. Mechilta asks an incredible question. You get to the moment of the actual Exodus. You get to the moment of the crossing of the Red Sea. The people are standing there, up still against a wall of water that has not yet split. And they see Mitzrayim nosea achareihem. The Egyptians are chasing after them. The Egyptians are not chasing after them on foot. Because actually, in the preparation for this moment, when Pharaoh understands that they've left, Vayugad lamelech Mitzrayim ki varach ha'am, it says, Vayikach shesh meot rechev bachur. He took 600 chariots. And look what the Mechilta asks. Mishel mi hayu habehemot, shayu toanim hamerkavot. Where'd they get the animals? Where'd they get the horses to pull the chariots? Im tomar mishel Mitzrayim hayu, v'halo kvar ne'amar v'yamot kol miknei Mitzrayim. They can't be the Egyptians, because the Egyptians' animals, their livestock, their horses, Hinei Yad Hashem Hoya, Basusim, including the horses, those were all wiped out in Dever. Ve'im tomar mishel Paro hayu, v'halo kvar ne'amar Hinei Yad Hashem Hoya b'miknecha asher basadeh. If you want to say, no, it wasn't the Egyptians, but Paro was allowed to have some things survive. No. B'miknecha, your cattle is also being wiped out. Ve'im tomar mishel Yisrael hayu, and if you want to say, well, the Israelites had to leave animals behind, but they say when they leave, v'gam mikneinu yelech imanu lo tishayer parsa, we're not going to leave one hoof behind. We're taking all our animals. So there's no one left. So who's left? Ela shel mi hayu? Shel hayarei et dvar Hashem. The only animals left were the animals of the God-fearing of Pharaoh's servants who brought them inside during the plague of hail, and they survived. And then they were commandeered by Pharaoh at the moment of the Exodus to go and chase Bnei Israel. Devastating line now. Nimtzeinu lemedim hayarei et devar Hashem heim hayu takala liYisrael. The God-fearing of Pharaoh's servants, they were ultimately an impediment and a near-death experience for the Israelites. And the coup de grace at the end, Rabbi Shimon, Tov shebagoyim harog. We learn from here, I don't care how good the Gentiles are, kill them. Now, what does that mean, right? What is that statement of Rabbi Shimon? Aside from putting Rabbi Shimon in historical context, and I don't know what I would say if I lived through the Hadrianic persecutions either. But what it's doing here in this Midrash is the notion of what's the problem with the Yarei Dvar Hashem. The Yarei Dvar Hashem is actually a good person. But if the Yarei Dvar Hashem is located in an impossible, systemically evil system, his resources will be commandeered to persecute and kill the innocent and the weak. When Rabbi Shimon says Tov shebagoyim harog, he means it in the context of When you're living in the age of the Hadrianic persecution and you are the Jews and the Roman Empire is evil, you recognize the Roman Empire's power is all-encompassing. And therefore, any resource that is at its disposal, it is going to find a way to turn against you. Again, putting aside what anyone would or wouldn't say after a given personal and historical experience, the point of this Midrash is the second lesson about Iyov's crossover character. Don't think that just because someone is a Yerei Elokim, as is Iyov, that the systemic forces of evil are not fundamentally going to get the better of them. They may be pious, but their piety will always fundamentally be limited to an individual level if they live in a corrupt and wicked society. You actually can't feel that unless you put Iyov in this narrative. The power of this crossover midrash is instead of just reading through, people were afraid. They were all terrible. They were all Nazis. The crossover says, no, they weren't. Actually, Iyov was a good guy. Actually, even in Paro's palace, they were good people. But the thing you have to understand, if you want to understand what was going on in Mitzrayim, if you want to understand Shibud B'nai Israel, you have to understand it as taking place in a society where there were good people. And Iyov was one of those people. And to think that the problem is adjudicating each individual person's righteousness is to miss the point about the more societal level of evil, corruption, and therefore corresponding redemption that had to take place. Let's pivot with that to the third point and the third crossover lesson. And this, to me, is actually one of the most poignant pieces of this unexpected appearance of Iyov, which is Chazal's real-eyed take on redemption, on political deliverance, on change, on revolution, and their unwillingness to tell a Pollyannish story that it's actually possible for some people to be redeemed without other people suffering. And this comes in the remarkable Midrash kicked off here by Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chani. He says the following in Shmot Rabbah. When Israel was coming out of Mitzrayim, Samael, the angel, the Satan, the rabbinic term for the Satan in the book of Iyov, the angel Samael came to fight against, to argue against the people, and then being worthy of redemption. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina explained it in the name of his father as following through a parable. A shepherd was crossing his sheep across the river, and a wolf came to attack them. What does an experienced shepherd do? He takes a big old goat and hands him over to the wolf, thinking, let the wolf struggle with the goat. This will buy us time to cross the river. And then I'll go back and get the goat. What's the parable? I've got a predator, and I've got prey that will be finished off in 1 minute. Then I've got something that's kind of prey, and it can function that way for a while. It won't last forever, but it's actually going to take a while for a wolf to take down a stubborn, kicking goat, as opposed to a young sheep. And so as a diversionary tactic, the goat buys the time needed to cross everyone over. Then I'll go back, I'll get the goat. He might be a little injured, but he'll make it. He can give me the 30 minutes that I need to get across. Similarly, when Israel left Egypt, the angel Samael came to argue against them in God's presence. Here was the argument. Ribono shel olam. These people are idolaters. You're going to split the sea for them? We know from Yechezkel and from hints even in Shmot and the later Midrashic tradition, Eilu avdei kochavim ve'eilu avdei kochavim. The Israelites, whatever they preserved in terms of their names and in terms of their dress and their language, they were completely culturally assimilated into Egyptian culture. Complete and total idolatry. right? Lavo lakachat lo goy mikerev goy is the Midrash. One nation had to be ripped out of another because they were so ensconced. V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Only 20% of them got out. 80% of them had to be killed under the fog of darkness in Makat Choshech because they didn't want to leave. Samael comes and says, give me a break. You're going to split the sea for these people? So what did God do? God handed him the goat, Yves, who was one of Pharaoh's advisors. Why? Because he was complete and honest. He was tam v'yashar. God said to him, to Samael, I hereby hand him over to you. God thought, well, Samael is dealing with Yves. Israel can make it through the sea, and then I'll go back to get Yves. And this is the most amazing mapping of these two stories onto each other, because now it's not just that we have sort of hints that this is playing out during the Makot, during the plagues, but the entire drama of the Satan coming and picking a fight with Yves in that book is actually a diversionary tactic instigated by God at the moment when they're getting ready to cross the sea. Yves comes in out of left field in order to create the possibility for the redemption of Bnei Yisrael. Now, there's a fantastic way in which it gives you a bracketing of the Satan. Why is he there? Why is God giving into the Satan in the story of Yves? Because God has another purpose. The whole book is a diversion. So it does something well for us on that level of understanding. How could God behave in that way? But I want to contend to you it's doing something actually much more profound than that, which it is understanding that there is no Yetziat Mitzrayim without an Yves. There is no such thing as taking down an entire culture, a superstructure. There is no way to enable a people to move from one place to another, to reinvent themselves in a different land, without there being good and righteous people who suffer as a result. Chazal, I would claim to you, are deeply invested in putting Yves in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, because otherwise you will be tempted to end up with a naive, Pollyannish, Disneyland reading of national redemption, of the redemption of Bnei Yisrael, that you will think just happens and everything is sugar and candy all the way. The bad people get hurt, the oppressed are lifted up, and everything is fantastic and is made right. And Chazal, I think, knew that if you have that story and your entire understanding of redemption is built on that, the second you, God forbid, understand that perhaps someone suffered in the process, you may come to actually throw the whole narrative out. You may not actually be ready for redemption as it plays out in the real world. And so what they want to tell you is, of course innocent people suffered in order for Bnei Yisrael to leave. How could it be otherwise? What's the obligation? The obligation is, number one, to understand that, not to deny it. Number two, to recognize that redemption is still happening. People are crossing the sea and they're being liberated. And number three, like God, you've got to go back for Yves at the end. No redemption is actually complete without trying to go back for the good and innocent people who may have been harmed along the way and making them a part of the story and restoring them to what they lost. That, I think, is an incredibly powerful element of this last crossover piece and brings us to the end of this unit. It's the end of this journey of Yves, this sort of three sets of lessons that I'm suggesting are a part of it. The end of this piece that we've been doing tonight that included Yves Yftsan and Boaz of looking for this midrashic technique of crossover characters to enable us to get to a whole other level of texture in the biblical narrative and our understanding of it. And the end of the three-part series here of looking at this craft of midrash in what I hope have been three different and stimulating ways, but that opened the portal to exploring so many more, again, of incredible readers who loved the Tanakh and hoped we would too, and bearers of incredible ideas who want to see those ideas not just live in the ether, but actually in the expanded canon that the Midrash makes possible. We have a few moments for a few questions. I'll welcome folks to weigh in on this. I'll have time maybe for one or two here. Razi, please go ahead. We'll get there.
Okay. I think that some of these stories remind me of Talmudic stories, and I wonder to what extent the sages project. The story about the three advisors of Pharaoh reminds me of the three sages that talked about the Romans and all the public works that they did. One praised it, one was silent, and one criticized it. And it's about the same story. And the first story about Yves Yftsan is very similar to the story about Kamtza Uvar Kamtza, that Kamtza doesn't want to invite a person and actually goes a long way not inviting him. So to what extent is this projection relevant even?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love the connection to the story of what ends in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave, the three rabbis and the Romans. Which I do think, I had not thought of it, has some good echoes about what's the sort of proper role that you play in those settings. The moral, I'm not sure, is exactly the same, because the one, right, who praises is definitely in a bad light there. But the one who rebels too much, like Rabbi Shimon, doesn't come out 100% great for him in that story in a way that I think he's not perfectly parallel to Yitro. And I think the thing that is different is this is a reflection on people who are in the corridors of power, even if they're not making all the decisions, in a way that rabbinic story is about kind of the disempowered, disenfranchised, and negotiating their relationship to the government. So it's a really interesting parallel, and I think there are some differences there. As far as the second bit, just say it again, the second connection?
Yftsan with Kamtza and Bar Kamtza.
Right. So there too, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, part of what to me is so powerful about the Boaz Yftsan crossover is Boaz is really given an act two, right? In a way that the Yftsan character is able to be reinvented as Boaz, in a way that the host who messes up with Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, it just leads to destruction. So there's some parallel there. But I would encourage, in the way I've been doing throughout here, to kind of push for what are the things we see that are animating the idea in each one and how they may be distinctive. Linda and Ezra, that's all we have time for. Yeah. Hopefully we can get you unmuted. Great. You're
okay, good. I've got unmuted. Okay. Afghanistan. With the pullout and not going back for those who stayed seems like a very powerful modern day truism of that last story.
That's an interesting parallel. Yeah, I mean, I think the goal of Midrash is to get us to think mythically about the present in all kinds of ways. And there's always a million questions when we get to what are the right mappings to make. But the notion of responsibility, that we have more broadly for processes of redemption that we may try to put into place, I think is a really important one. Yes, Ezra, we're going to give you, I think, the last comment here.
I'm struggling with the Hatosha Bagoyim Harog. Is the implication that Eov is like an Eichmann? Like, not like even the good guys are bad, right? Or is it that like he's really good, but he's just overpowered by the like systemic anti-Semitism?
I think it's more the latter. That's my reading of that Midrash. It's talking about the systemic anti-Semitism, the systemic evil, and there's a kind of sense of that person's bank account is just waiting to be seized by the regime. And therefore, if you want a version of this, the best pop culture version I can think of this is in the first Matrix, where basically they're taking them around through the simulated world, and it's like every person plugged into the Matrix is a potential agent. If you don't get the reference, it's okay. That's the idea. On some level, they're an innocent person. They may even be a good person, but they are in a system that is just going to actually commandeer their body to hurt you. So it's a broad claim, right? But I think it is actually coming from a totalizing experience of disempowerment in a very deep way. I'm going to respect our end time here and just thank you tremendously for coming along this journey. So many more questions, so much more to do. I hope, if nothing else, I've kindled a little bit more of a potential love for and interest in Midrash. I hope we'll get a chance to learn this and other things in the future. And as Morty said, there's so much happening at Hadar in person and online right now. Please continue to join us. A happy Thanksgiving and a wonderful Hanukkah to all.